Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, those who are here in person and those who are joining us via the live stream. We're delighted that you have decided to spend a little time with us. For those who don't know, my name is Daniel Horan, and I'm a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. And I am delighted to welcome you to our extraordinary panel this afternoon. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to say a little bit about the center for those who are unfamiliar. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we at the center draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Also, before we proceed with our exciting panel this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. In particular, we recognize the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our Native siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. It is my pleasure now to turn the stage over to my colleague, Dr. Julia Fetter, the Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality, who will introduce our panelists and facilitate our event this afternoon.
Good evening. I have the delightful job of introducing our esteemed panelists. And after I do so, I'll tell you a little bit more about the structure of our evening together. So our first panelist is Julie Tourtillotte, who is a professor of art, affiliated faculty in environmental studies, and chair of the art department here at St. Mary's, where she teaches courses in fibers, fabric painting, sustainable textiles, drawing, and video art. Julie received her MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and a BFA from St. Mary's College. She has exhibited her artwork throughout the United States, including at the National Museum for Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and her work is in private and museum collections, including the South Bend Museum of Art and the Detroit Institute of Art. She has received Indiana Arts Commission and National Endowment for the Arts grants in recognition of her work, and a faculty research grant supported her study of shibori techniques in Aramatsu, Japan, with Yoshiko Wada and the World Shibori Network. Her artwork incorporates natural dyeing, hand stitching, handmade felt, shibori resist dyeing, screen printing, and embroidery. And Julie and her family maintain 20 organic acres, including a dye garden and art studio adjacent to Potato Creek Park in South Bend. Our second presenter will be Sally Geislar, who is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at St. Mary's College. She earned a PhD in Urban Planning and Public Policy from the School of Social Ecology at the University of California, Irvine. In her interdisciplinary research, Sally uses quantitative and qualitative methods to examine how individuals and industry influence, implement, and sometimes undermine policy outcomes. Her primary areas of interest include food waste behaviors, community compost systems, and food justice. Her work has been published in top journals across several fields, including environment and behavior, waste management, and philosophy of science, as well as in the popular press. And recently, she completed a field work with a student researcher in a SISTAR-funded project in which the team mapped the dedicated trees and their environmental benefits on this campus. Subsequent phases of the project will connect alumna stories to the trees, explore students' sense of place on campus, and their experience of the otherwise invisible benefits unfolding in the world around them. And our final panelist will be Sincere Cannon, who is a St. Mary's student in her junior year. She is currently studying nursing science with minors in sociology and dance. She will tell us more about how she grew up in Hobart, Indiana for most of her life, but then her family moved to Gary, Indiana, her freshman year of college. Although the two towns are less than 20 minutes apart, their landscapes and resources are drastically different. This prompted her and inspired her to think about the ways that people might still interact with the divine in environments that are much less fruitful and fortunate than others. You might notice that we're missing one panelist. Matthew Inslee, our farm manager. Unfortunately, Matthew is sick, and he is very disappointed that he is not able to make it tonight. And we are very disappointed not to have him, but send all of our best wishes to him for a speedy recovery. Our program this evening will have 3 parts. First, we will hear a little bit from each panelist here from the podium. Second, I will moderate a conversation between the panelists. And third, we'll open up the conversation to our in-person and live-streamed audiences. So hold your questions, but be thinking about them. So let us welcome our first speaker, Professor Tourtillotte.
Thank you. When I was invited by the Center for the Study of Spirituality, and specifically Julia Fetter, to be on this panel, she recommended that I attend the presentation by Dr. Rachel Wheeler, who came to campus on September 12th to speak about eco-spirituality. I was curious and wanted to learn more about this subject and how I might personally connect to this spiritual practice. As Dr. Wheeler spoke, I jotted down words that resonated with me: gratitude, awe, kinship, reciprocity. I made note of the subjects she touched on, such as radical kinship, balancing wonder with familiarity, ecological conversion, rewilding, and the great turning. In her book on eco-spirituality, Wheeler discusses the cosmologist and geologian Thomas Berry, who wrote that, quote, "The sacred is that which evokes the depths of wonder." Wheeler states that when defining the sacred, Berry chose to focus on that which evokes awe and wonder, which for many may be God, and yet most of these evocations occur as encounters with the natural world, with beauty, with something that draws us not only out of ourselves, but also even more deeply into ourselves. I found the chapter in Berry's book, The Sacred Universe, Earth, Spirituality, and Religion in the 21st Century, where he writes about the world of wonder and laments that rather than choosing to be a life-enhancing species, humans have instead often acted as predators, exploiting the land for economic gain. If we in the world are to survive, he warns, we need to see the value of the land and obey its laws. We need to revere every living creature and view our land as sacred space. We must protect and foster the living forms of this planet in a comprehensive manner. He firmly states that a change must occur deep in our souls. I agree that change and action are needed, but how do you keep from feeling overwhelmed, even hopeless, when it comes to addressing the significant problems such as climate change? In her talk, Dr. Wheeler shared the work of eco-philosopher, activist, and scholar of Buddhism, Joanna Macy, who calls for a great turning that I find hopeful and can help us to develop resilience in facing today's challenges. Macy defines the Great Turning as the essential adventure of our time, a shift from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining civilization. Macy describes 3 different dimensions of the Great Turning. The first is actions that we can take to slow damage to the earth and its beings. This might be legislative, political protest, personal actions. Second, she said, requires an analysis of structural causes and the creation of structural alternatives. And the third dimension, she says, requires a shift in consciousness or a spiritual awakening. Macy teaches that the realizations we make in this third dimension save us from succumbing to either panic or paralysis. They help us resist the temptation to stick our heads in the sand or to turn on each other. In other words, without a shift in consciousness or spiritual awakening, we risk burnout that can prevent our progress on the first 2 steps, taking action and making structural changes. I believe that healing the earth will require each of us to act, and that we can start by showing gratitude, respect, and love for the earth in whatever way we can. To connect with my own story, my husband, son, and I live on 18.5 acres, actually, in the southwest corner of South Bend, across the road from Potato Creek State Park. Over the past 24 years, we have converted land that was farmed industrially into fields, prairie, woods, and garden. And to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, we have installed solar panels that provide 95% of the electricity that powers and heats our home. And those are pictures of our fields there, and my husband and son burning some of the prairie in May. As an artist, I became interested in a shift to sustainable practices and looked for materials and methods that do not cause harm to the environment or to humans. I turned to natural dyeing in my work and began to grow dye plants among the vegetables in our home garden. That's me standing in front of the Hopi black dye sunflowers, which just tower over me, that we're also growing at the farm. These are a couple examples of works I'd made over the past couple years using natural dyes. And whenever I can, I include salvaged and recycled materials. I'd read William McDonough and Michael Brongart's book, Cradle to Cradle, shortly after it was published in 2003. In the book, the authors call for a paradigm shift in the way we manufacture things so that all materials can be fully recycled within a circular system that is either biological or technological. I was pleased to see the cradle-to-cradle concept of zero waste identified by Rachel Wheeler in her book as an eco-spiritual practice. My artwork tends to be slow handwork that involves methodical stitching, embroidery, knitting, hand cutting, or felting. I suppose for me, the work acts as a form of meditation and is my own spiritual practice. In 2011, I developed a course in sustainable textiles and fibers that I continue to teach here at St. Mary's. As a class, we discussed the significant environmental damage that is caused by the fashion and textile industry that has only been accelerated by the growth of fast fashion. We read from sources like Cradle to Cradle and Rebecca Burgess's book, Fiber Shed, with its regional farm to closet vision for the clothes we wear. The students in the class learn to make paper from recycled denim and local sustainably harvested plants, which you see them doing here on the screen. And they also work with natural dyes and creatively explore mending and upcycling. And the students practice mindful, slow fiber methods such as shibori binding and stitch resist techniques. And I think you can see how happy Anna is with the results of her work. Over the years, the students and I dreamed of planting our own dye garden on campus. The development of the St. Mary's Sustainable Farm gave us the opportunity to make this dream a reality. Hannah Tepp planted our first dye garden at the farm in the summer of 21 as a capstone project for her environmental studies minor. Hannah built 4 8-foot beds, but with no fencing or water at the farm at this time, she came up against a number of obstacles that included the groundhogs eating 2/3 of her seedlings. She persisted And despite that, she was able to produce at least a half dozen colors of her own. I tried to keep Hannah's dye garden going during the summer of 2022 by growing cosmos, coreopsis, and marigolds in her original beds. But you can imagine my response when our new farm manager at the time, Matthew Inslee, told me he planned to set aside 11 50-foot rows for the dye garden for this summer. That meant the garden was going to grow more than 10 times the original size. I was excited and frankly overwhelmed. With his student volunteers, Matthew started the seeds and transplanted the seedlings into the majority of the beds by the time I was free to come help at the end of May. I started coming out to the farm a couple mornings each week to keep things weeded and watered until the irrigation was put in and the plants were established. By the beginning of July, the garden started to take off. And by early August, we had abundance, which is still out at the farm. We're growing 12 different dye plants at the farm this year, and that will yield colors from blue, red, and yellow to orange, purple, green. We're very excited. Just last week, my class was out at the farm harvesting dye materials that went right into the dye pots when we returned to the studio. And you see some of our first tests here with marigolds and cosmos. And it's just always so amazing to see the intense color you get from these plants. I have so much gratitude for what the farm has provided. The gift I didn't realize I would receive when I set out to weed and water the dye garden at the start of the summer was the wonderful, generous community of people I have met at the farm. Farmer Matthew, Professor Chris Cobb, and Maria Gonzalez Diaz have done so much to foster that community and make the farm a success. I am truly grateful for all that is thriving due to their efforts. And I thought I would end by sharing the fortunes I received with my Chinese takeout last week. The very sweet woman who works at the counter at China House on Mishawaka Avenue always tucks something extra into your bag. And this week it was extra fortune cookies. I got 3. So as I opened each fortune, I was struck by how, in my mind, they seemed to magically connect to what I was reading in Thomas Berry's writing. As I was looking ahead to this talk, and I thought, these are possibly Confucian phrases, which might make sense in their connection to Thomas Berry. So to close, I'd like to circle back and share a few more of Berry's words. In The Sacred Universe, he offers that, quote, "We must remember that it is not only the human world that is held in this sacred enfoldment, but the entire planet. We need this security, this presence throughout our lives. The sacred is that which evokes the depths of wonder. We may know some things, but really we know only the shadow of things." Thank you.
Well, that was really wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be here. And I'm even happier that all of you showed up to join us virtually or in person in this conversation today. And I'm grateful that Professor Tourtillotte shared some of those themes from the last event, because I see so many of them emerging in my own thoughts on this subject. When I was first asked to come and share my thoughts and my experiences on transcendence in nature, especially, 2 scenes came to mind. One mundane and the other far from it. The latter, perhaps more familiar to many in the room, happens in the presence of nature's grandeur, as when emerging from a narrow mountain canyon into an alpine meadow, flanked on all sides by impressive purple peaks, or as when allowing first your toes and then your whole feet and your ankles to sink into the countless granules of sand as the ocean makes room for you at its edge, or as when cresting the rim of a red and white desert canyon as the sun slips beneath its pink and orange cloak of sky. I find myself with an embarrassment of riches in this form of transcendental experience as I've pursued nature's wonders in far-off places. But the other, perhaps more surprising form of transcendence in nature is much more close at hand. One such experience in particular stands out to me because it helped to launch my journey into what would become an area of expertise in urban food waste systems. This journey began, like many things do, in the garden. I was living in the graduate student apartments in Irvine, California, and had finally emerged from the wait list for a coveted plot in the community garden. Not long after, of course, the compost manager enlisted me to coordinate volunteers over the summer to help keep the pile alive for a month. Now, long before turning my first compost pile, I knew intellectually that mixing the right portion of brown waste or carbon and green food scraps as nitrogen with water and air would over time produce compost. But it wasn't until I turned these recognizable pineapple tops and banana peels under my labor and my pitchfork, witnessing them begin to take new form in a collective, emerging completely transformed as rich Black earth, that I gained a deep experiential understanding. As I returned the finished compost to its bin for others in the garden to take from it freely what they needed to flourish, it seemed so clear to me in that moment that everything should work this way. Conversely, I was left with the question, why did so many things that we produce and consume in our society fall outside of this cycle of life, decay, new life, decay? Why were so many of the fruits of our labors not shared more freely among our community? So in preparing for today, I was reflecting on these two types of transcendental experiences in nature because what appeared to be a new tension emerged. The first type of transcendental experience, inspired by grand scenes, is removed from the everyday, at least for most of us in the Midwest. And the other seems intensely connected to the everyday. To this first type, I have felt called to preserve those far-off places, inspired in part by the late Joseph Sachs, an environmental lawyer who argued in his book, Mountains Without Handrails, that one role our national parks serve is in preserving unmanicured spaces, wherein those who are able to encounter nature on its own terms can enjoy the freedom of experience. He wrote that, quote, one should go into the wilderness as Moses did to find God, and that the parks, quote, provide an opportunity for self-fulfillment not offered elsewhere in modern society, which fosters an excessive urge to consume. The parks, he argued, can cultivate a taste for a reflective recreation. In my words, one that does not result from a focus group in a corporate branding office. After attending a talk of his just before his death in 2014, I found manicured spaces and manicured experiences all around me in the modern world. And as I said, I felt intensely the need to preserve those places that were not designed by modern humans, that did not privilege a set of experiences while obscuring, excluding, or erasing others. And yet there I was, encountering transcendence in a context that was highly manipulated by humans. The apartment complex, the community garden, the compost bin. Every one of these words and worlds is intensely human-oriented. They are, at least on the surface, human-scaled. By contrast, transcendence, at least to a layperson on the matter like me, is the experience beyond the ordinary physical human scale. In the case of the mountains, the sea, and the canyon, the transcendence is inspired by the immensity of the world of which we are a part. Transcendence in the compost pile emerges differently. We are encountering the work of thousands or millions of tiny, even microscopic beings. Their work is unfolding at an extended time scale that operates almost imperceptibly slowly to humans, at least most humans with better things to do than watch the grass grow. And it's here in my preparations for today that I realized, of course, these grand scenes are also sculpted by millions of beings and processes, microscopic and otherwise. They're operating on timescales even more imperceptibly slow, carving canyons and meadows from granite and sandstone. But the immediacy of the massive makes transcendence on offer to nearly any casual observer. Whereas to marvel at the mundane, the gradual processes that make our world function, this requires an attentiveness that necessarily incorporates knowledge about those processes and about our interdependence on their good works. And it's here that I'm inspired by the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer, botanist, poet, indigenous scholar. She argues that this attentiveness or attention is a doorway to gratitude, the doorway to wonder, the doorway to reciprocity. And you may wonder, why should attentiveness yield gratitude and reciprocity? Well, of course, these are natural responses to receiving a gift. Our attention to the work of the natural world illuminates its gifts. As Pope Francis wrote in his encyclical Laudato Si, to which we will tomorrow have a sequel, the earth is a shared inheritance for which we are called to tend. He warns that, quote, if we approach nature without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on our immediate needs. Wall Kimmerer likewise evokes that relationship with the world. For gifts, in essence, create a set of relationships that entail responsibilities rather than rights, responsibilities to give and receive, and of course, to reciprocate. She argues that in response to the many gifts, the earth asks that we renounce a culture of endless taking so that the world may continue. So here we can see a reciprocal response to the gift of those millions of microorganisms and other processes at work that make life on earth possible is to give of our own gifts. And in reflecting on that false tension between these types of transcendence, I see that both entail an awe that it is imbued with our kinship with the world. Both types of these transcendent experiences can inspire humility. Humility as the world tells us in no uncertain terms about our smallness in relation to its vast unfolding. But in so doing, the world is also telling us about our place in it, about our connectedness to the greater whole, like a tiny link in an immense net. So what I take with me from this is that we don't need to seek far off places to encounter awe, but we do need to slow down, to make space for awe. We do need to learn to see the small things at work in the natural world all around us. In doing this, we learn how we need the natural world and each other to take of their gifts, but also how to give our gifts in return. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I really enjoyed your talk. I love how you started off with the quote, "Why are the fruits of our labors not shared in our community?" And this idea of wonder and reciprocity. And it was such a beautiful coincidence because that's a lot about what I'm talking about. So for me, my encountering with the divine has been in nature. I grew up in Maryville, and I lived in an apartment that overlooked a small lake with vast willow and pine trees. And as a child, I spent all of my free time outside because the land pulled me onto a feeling that I could not place, but one that just really tugged at my heartstrings. I would talk to the trees and dance carelessly because I felt small, but not in an insignificant way, in a way that the trees and the lake and the land were my protectors and a reflection of my safety. I moved to Hobart in 8th grade, and in high school, I started working at my school in the gardens and planting. And it was just something about planting a tiny seed and watching it sprout day by day. We gave it love and care, and it rewarded us. And that idea of reciprocity, of you give to the land and it gives back to you in such a fruitful way. So that prompted me when I started my freshman year at St. Mary's. Um, I started St. Mary's the year that the campus started working on the farm. And so I was out there pulling the weeds and building the compost, and I had the most fun working with my peers. And I'd go to the farm on Tuesdays at 8 when the sun was just really starting to illuminate the fields. And like as I looked out on the land that was like unfinished but had so much potential, I had that familiar feeling of smallness return to me. But spring semester of my freshman year, I got a call from my mom saying that we were going to lose our house. And I just remember feeling such sadness, and I really withdrew from the planting and the nature and the gardening. And I felt such hopelessness at the idea that here I am at St. Mary's, surrounded by such beautiful nature, surrounded with the roof over my head and food, and not worrying about any of the material things that come with having a home. And my mom and my siblings are at home, and I don't know what they're going through. Um, but a couple weeks later, by the grace of God, I got a phone call saying that we found a house, and she goes, "But it's in Gary, Indiana." And I'm like, I had this initial idea of like apprehension because like we all hear the stereotypes and the presumptions that come with areas such as Gary, Indiana. Um, and I can say though that my first impression of Gary when I went to see my house, literally as we drove over the border, I felt a palpable change in the energy. I felt such sadness and just loneliness and desolation because I'm looking at the neighborhoods and the infrastructures, and it is such different in terms of imagery from South Bend and Hobart and Maryville. And I began thinking, what if that energy is a reflection of the environment? And what does that environment look like? Um, One thing that is very prevalent in Gary, Indiana, in terms of environment is just the food deserts. So a food desert is defined as having an area having 20% poverty rate, where 33% of the population lives more than a mile from the nearest grocery store. And a mile may not seem like that much, but when you're thinking about other barriers such as transportation, childcare to watch your children while you go to the grocery store, financial resources or lack thereof, we begin to see that it's more than just about food. It's more than just about food insecurity. And in Lake County alone, there are 23 food deserts, but 14 of those are in Gary, Indiana. And so this idea that it's more than food insecurity, because the food insecurity just points to a structural lack of equity and resources. In Gary, there are next to no public parks, the beaches are heavily littered, and the air and the soil is polluted from its heavy factory and industry days. So I had this idea of sometimes the land is a reflection of God and God is a reflection of us, I feel like, or we're a reflection of God. So when I think about eco-spirituality, the first thing that comes to mind is the creation story. To me, it seems like there was a concept where the creator constructed the land and the environment in a likeness to himself, where Genesis describes all the elements like the birds and the waters and the bountiful food. When I lived in Maryville and Hobart, when I'm on St. Mary's and the farm, I see and I feel God in the environment. I see an environment that is vast and healthy and fruitful, and I see and I feel a purpose. So that got me into thinking, what is the opposite side of that? For people who are born and raised in the urban sides of Gary, where there are resource deserts and abandoned houses littered on every street, what do they see? If one looks around and sees brokenness in their environment, could that translate into a hopelessness that seeps into their faith? That imagery of the environment in Genesis, it is so beautiful, and I feel that it is what God intended for us. So why are there so many areas that don't have it? And if one doesn't see God in the environment, where do they see it? I was thinking about this, and for me, I see it in the people. I see it in the people of my community. I've been living in Gary for about 1.5 years now, and I can say that the city is full of life. I talk to my neighbors, I interact with my citizens, I walk children to the local library, and the city is just blooming in terms of its people. And when I interact with families, I feel a light in them, but I want them to go out and see that light reflected in their community, in their environment, and it is not right now. Going back to this idea of being small, we want to be small in a way that makes us feel protected by the land and the environment, not small in a way that makes us feel isolated and forgotten about by others. And I feel like it starts with us. It starts with the people going out and doing that labor and tending to our environment and making it fruitful and beautiful, so that when people go out, they see that environment and they know that that is a reflection of them. And so I'm just very grateful to have conversations like this. And yeah, that's all I got. Thank you.
Well, that really extended beyond my wildest dreams. That was amazing. Hearing from each one of you is really a gift to us. I'm curious about this last image that Sincere offered for us of this feeling of smallness as a good thing when it's not feeling small in an insignificant way, but a protected way, not a feeling of smallness as being isolated and forgotten, but being a part of a larger whole. And I'm wondering if the other panelists might have a response to that. I noticed, in your slides, Professor Tourtillotte, that there were all these beautiful people that we know up there, and it felt to me like there's a sense of community. But maybe you can speak to that, and then also, Professor Geislar, I mean, you said just so directly that gift creates relationships, and so I'm wondering if any of the three of you had some thoughts on the threads here that could be woven between the three presentations on that feeling of smallness. And you can feel free to use the mics there.
First, I thought that was such, is this working? At first, I thought that was such a beautiful metaphor that Sincere offered us. Think about small in that manner. And she used words about feeling free and dancing carelessly and all the joy that came from that as she thought about how the natural world, was this protector and really this sacred place. And then to transition to Gary as her new home in a very different kind of environment. I felt like when I heard that joy return to you, it became about the connections and the relationships to the people. And that in a sense, you could be small and big together as a group. And I thought that was just really wonderful.
Yeah, I was also struck. This is in my notes as well, the small, but not in an insignificant way. And so I appreciate that perspective. And I'm seeing it connect in the sense that we are small And we do need each other. We need communities, but they don't just happen to us anymore. If there ever was a time, it's not now, that you have to go and build that community and tend the garden, as you were saying. And that one of the ways that we can do this is by giving of those gifts that we have. And that takes some self-reflection on what those gifts are that we can give, but you have to move beyond that into action, into giving of that gift. Yeah. And when you have all of these people coming together to do that, then you can have that protection, that part of being part of a larger whole without losing yourself.
For me, like just this idea of community, like you both talked about it, how you talked about like creating the compost so that then others can come and get it. And then when you talked about like making the land to be able to plant the flowers and get the colors, just this idea of coming together, and we each offer our own different fruits of labor that contribute to this idea of like greater good and interacting with our environment. So I thought that was really special.
I was really glad, Professor Geislar, that you mentioned the big event that's coming up tomorrow. There's a lot going on right now in terms of cultivating sacred ecology in the Catholic world. So as Professor Geislar mentioned, tomorrow we have part 2, as it were, of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And I am struck by, on this panel, so many of the themes that he talked about really coming out, in particular, the idea that we don't have 2 separate crises, an environmental crisis and then a social crisis, but instead it's one crisis that's both environmental and social. And any response to the crises that we face have to be multifaceted, that we have to combat poverty, we need to protect nature, we need to conserve species, all in one integrated effort. And so that was really moving to me, how your presentations really spoke to that. We don't know what this statement will be tomorrow that will be released, but I wonder if we could have as an imaginative exercise that Pope Francis a month ago didn't have it written yet and gave you a phone call and said, this is due date's really coming up here. What should I write about? What advice would you give him, or what things would you tell him that you really wanted to see in there?
Challenging question that evokes a lot of thought, because there's so much responsibility with the platform that the Pope has and the inspiration that he can provide. And also that the Laudato Si encyclical was so all-encompassing. I mean, I teach so many components of it across my different classes, even just today. And at times it feels like, what more could you say about this? We already know what we need to do. We're not doing it. We already know many of the contours of the crisis, even as they continue to change, the roots are the same, and we aren't taking the action that's necessary. And I think one of the components that I would hope he could provide is a way to encourage people into that transition, into that shift, that societal shift, that spiritual awakening that Professor Tourtillotte was referencing from other scholars as well, and what it will take to weather that storm. that there will be sacrifices, and we do have to look out for each other, recognizing we're part of that community, building community where there isn't any yet, and helping each other through that transition. Because as many of the world's scientists are telling us, we are approaching tipping points where a continued practice of business as usual and not taking action on it can lock in some serious changes, some irreversible. And I think we have a hard time coping with big irreversible changes as mere individuals. And so that message of seeing ourselves as part of a collective of people who will be impacted, who do care, who want a better world, and leaning into that community to take action, I think is so crucial and can help us weather that storm. So I think that should be part of your message, Pope Francis, on our phone call.
I think I'd ask him. I would ask Pope Francis to make sure that he brings into the conversation different kinds of people, and to make sure that he talks in a way that invites people into the conversation without excluding them. And that can be unintentionally, because I'm realizing now that like I have people back at home that's watching the live stream, and like when we have these conversations and just like the diction that we use in terms of how advanced our words are or ideas are in terms of academia, a lot of people that these subjects affect, they may not be as how do I say, not experienced, but just be more like understanding of it. Like we use words like sacred ecology, but to the average person, like what does that actually mean and what does that actually look like? So just making sure that we're doing it in terms that the common person can understand, so that we are inviting them into the conversation and not excluding them with these big academic ideas and such.
I have lots of fragments of thoughts, but maybe one I'll share was asking him what he could do to bridge our political divides, because that would be a pretty big ask. But I think when we look at the challenges we face in today's world, we often come up against obstacles where we can't work together. And he would be in a position maybe to help us see things differently and call, for a spiritual awakening from everyone, no matter what side of the political spectrum you fall on.
I have another hard question for you. So if an imaginative one, actually. So let's say that it's 20 years from now, and if you could control the universe, what dreams would you have for the St. Mary's community? What wild imaginings would you have about how the St. Mary's community could live deeper into an awe for creation? I heard many folks talk about awe or wonder, and action for ecological justice. So don't think about budgetary concerns, just dream wildly. Yeah.
Okay, it's on. So this summer, like I'm gonna call them out. I went to Fair Oaks Farm, and I just saw like the way that the animals lived, and it was just very like unsettling to me. And this idea that like this earth is not ours alone. Like as humans, this idea of, I can't remember which one of you talked about it, but like how humans have been very predatory in terms of the way that we treat the earth and that we treat its animals. And so my grand idea is to be like, have this huge like farm where we produce all of our stuff, but we do it in a way that is not reflective of just like the mass industry and how they've been doing it, having thousands of animals cramped up in these tiny spaces, but where they can experience like free range and pastures. And doing so will benefit us not in terms of how we treat the animals, but the gifts that we receive from them, like the quality of our food if we didn't have so many pesticides and the way that the animals were treated. So I think big scale would just be, let's just bring all the animals over here and care for them.
I think it's an interesting question, what dreams we might have for the St. Mary's community, because of course we are part of this broader picture of what to do, what to do with, in and with and for the world. And we play an important part because we are potentially sending so many of these young people out into the world to be agents of change in their own way, in their own paths. And so one of the ways that I think our community can support the kind of world that we need to see is in empowering young people to be those agents of change, doing so through this larger lens of the histories that have brought us here today, or to the 20 years from now today, the structural forces that shape opportunity even before individuals have the chance to show their merits, to develop their gifts. And that we can do so in a context where we are fostering belonging and community in this scale in a way that people long for it and seek it even after they leave these four walls, so that they can go out and create it even where it may be deprived in their future paths. I think when you have that sense of belonging and community, you have that historical perspective and a larger vision for how decisions we make to structure society can shape things beyond an individual's power, can be really powerful for transforming the world, and can help people meet their basic needs and help others to do so, so that you can actually care and spend time on these issues that are beyond your individual, I have to feed myself, I have to have security and shelter, those lower levels of need, so that we can move beyond that. But that, again, we have to be doing that within community, within the context. So I don't know how many of those things directly address your question for this awe for creation, but I think we're creating the opportunity for those experiences through that broad type of education. That's my hope.
So 20 years from now, I hope the farm is still thriving and it's grown in the ways that Sincere has mentioned. I know we have lots of dreams for the ways that the farm could grow. So it'd be nice to see those realized even beyond what we're imagining now. It'd be great to come back and see that the college is sustainable in all its practices. It would be great to see, I know, as we talk about the imagining the avenue experience that the administration has been talking to us about, to see more opportunities for our students to be out in the community, kind of sharing these lessons and these perspectives, starting in South Bend and branching further. And for our students, I guess I'd like to see that they're having experiences that can take them out of their comfort zone and maybe out of themselves. I'm thinking of Sally's first image, and even though I love her description of the compost pile, it's like those wilderness trips and wilderness adventures, that we can kind of come full circle. So we're taking our gifts to others, and at the same time, we're I know Rachel Wheeler in her book, she talks a lot about forest bathing and, having those kinds of experiences, so that we're doing things that nurture ourselves as well as nurture others.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a great time to open it up to questions from our in-person or live streamed audience. You can feel free to ask hard questions too.
Just raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you.
So the question about the Pope, if he called you up, what do you think about saying to the Pope, teach people that we as humans are not masters of the earth, but rather stewards of the earth and creation?
And thank you for your question. I think it's a really important shift in our relationship to the world and to each other to take on this idea as stewards rather than masters, or rather than having dominance. I think we've spent much of human history just trying to survive nature and endure. That a narrative of dominance may have served a purpose, but certainly we have moved beyond that need, and that reframing our relationship to the world and to each other as stewards, tending the garden, can be so powerful, but does take some humility, right? In mastering, you ascend to power, you have status, you are above others. And I think that we, as a culture, really reify and validate those kinds of feelings, and that stewardship requires a different kind of relationship, one that I think culturally we have work to do in valuing as much as we do some of these other virtues. So that would be something I think that we could ask the Pope to hold up as values that guide us to a purpose in stewarding the world. Thank you.
I like this idea of like dominance, and I just think that dominance leaves people behind. And this culture of taking, it transcends more than the taking of land and spaces, because it creates a culture where people are allowed to take then opportunities from others. And I think back to just like the Gary situation, and how when you establish this dominance and when you become a predator to the resources that we are all capable of receiving, we are all deserving of receiving, then you leave people and groups and communities behind. So I just think we need to be more aware of the way that we take up space, and so that we take up space in a way that is humbling and that fosters humility, and not in a way that fosters dominance, or this idea that things belong to us inherently, because they don't. There are gifts, and we just need to be a little bit more mindful of the way that we receive those gifts, not just take them aimlessly. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've had a long history here in the United States of people seeing the land as a resource, ownership of the land, using those resources to benefit themselves first often, and not thinking of them in terms of being owned by a whole community that includes not only humans, but other species. And so the word reciprocity has come up a number of times, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who Dr. Geislar mentioned, writes really beautifully about it, so that, if you always think about what you're taking in contrast to then what you need to give back, and to make sure that what you take is sustainable. Even we were harvesting, we're growing those plants in the garden, but we can also go out and forage. And so if you take that mindset where it's like, you don't take all, I had her quote up there, take half. You don't take the first one, because maybe that's the last one. You don't know. You wait until you see that there's plenty and that it's sustainable to take. And I think you can apply that then to many things. So always taking care.
Thank you so much for this really rich conversation. I am aware that, or at least I have the impression that there are lots of environmental movements that are very successful and important that aren't necessarily talking about the world and our ecological crisis in terms of spirituality, right? In terms of God or the transcendent or the sacred. And I've been so moved to hear your insights about the sort of spiritual connection to these commitments that you have. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the difference that you think spirituality can make for talking about these things. Like what does that bring to the conversation for you that maybe other environmental conversations or movements might be missing if they're not talking about the spiritual or transcendent dimensions of these issues?
And kind of pick on what I'd said about Joanna Macy and the Great Turning, and that she said, you know, the third dimension of that was that spiritual awakening. And she really views it as, you know, how do you stay resilient? How do you stay positive in the face of big challenges? Like, how do you avoid burnout? You know, people, it becomes so overwhelming. She said, you just want to stick your head in the sand, you know? So like, what keeps you going? And so I think that kind of looking inward and finding that for yourself so that you can kind of constantly kind of find that next fountain of energy, you know, comes from that kind of source. You know, believing in something sacred, believing that it's that important, and that maybe there's these other powers that exist that can keep you going.
Yeah, I think it's an important question because we really need all hands on deck, right? And to some extent, to a large extent, I think one thing that something like transcendental experience can bring, even though it is one of these sort of highfalutin terms, is that it is, despite its name, accessible to people. It is another way or engages with another way of knowing. I think most people, if they haven't, certainly all people can have a transcendental experience, an experience beyond a human way of knowing or a physical human experience on the human scale. And so because it's this type of emotional response, you can access it in ways that don't require deep knowledge about the scientific underpinnings of some environmental crisis that we're facing or some technological solution that might bring us some relief. And so appealing to that way of encountering the world, I think, can evoke connections to the world that people may not have recognized as such. And that in that, there may be a sense of value or of reciprocity, that I've had this wonder, this awe, where however, you know, far off or mundane the place in which they encountered it. And that can really move people to action. And that we really need to engage all the senses when we are trying to think about what we can do about the crisis. So bringing more perspectives and more hands to the effort, I think, is necessary, and would certainly bring out, you know, new solutions. So, yeah, so I think that it brings an important way of knowing and encountering the world that hopefully would bring more people into the conversation, as Sincere had described earlier.
I think bringing spirituality into the conversation provides a purpose, and it appeals to more than just the practicality of why we need to do things to save the environment. Going back to that purpose, like I said, like it pulls at the heartstrings. And this idea of like accessibility, like if we add spirituality into the conversation, you know, I may not be able to relate to the physical barriers and the physical reasons for why your environment looks the way it does, but I can think back to that wonder and that awe and that connection to my faith, and I can relate to that. I can relate to you through that. Yeah.
How did you all reach your spiritual awakening? And once you had that kind of spiritual awakening, how did that alter and affect how you coped with living in a consumer-based society?
think I'll go back to one of the quotes in my PowerPoint, and that was Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she said, you don't have to wait for that spiritual awakening before you act, that in acting, it's like the land gives you that, so you start that. So I'm not going to say I'm necessarily fully awakened, but I do like taking that perspective. I think being on this panel kind of forced me to relook at some of that and to think about it more deeply. I know that, as a kid, I grew up in a city neighborhood here in South Bend. And so we had a small yard, but like my refuge was going out in the yard and gardening. And then, that was something when I met my husband and we joined forces. When we looked for a place to live, we always looked for like where we could put the garden. We needed an art studio, but we cared less what the house looked like and more what the land looked like and what we had access to. We knew that was enriching. And we're very lucky to live across the road from a park where we can walk in the woods regularly. And we often talk about like, that's our church in a sense, that's our spiritual experience, kind of being out there and paying attention. Slowing down is so important too. So I think that comes with, thinking about things spiritually, because we get so caught up in the busyness of, life here. And, there's always kind of a franticness and the next deadline that you're racing. And so I think when you can kind of pause and step back and think of things, more broadly, kind of slows you down, gives you appreciation for things. So I don't know if that answered your question about when or how, but I think it does come from kind of appreciating all the gifts around us.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I like this idea that the spiritual awakening doesn't have to come first. And I'm reflecting on, where some of this started for me. And I always ask my students as well, what, if anything, interests them in the environment or where that inspiration comes from. And actually, like Sincere mentioned, I spent a lot of my childhood in the wilderness near my home. And that was my refuge, to use Julie's word, to use Professor Tourtillotte's word, that I would, after school, escape into the woods and just wander on these animal paths, or bring a book and find a perch, or climb a tree, or chase the poor deer that I would encounter. They were fine. They ran much faster than me. And that just by encountering the natural world, you can find that spiritual awakening without even looking for it, I think, honestly. If you're open to exploration and you have a curiosity and you're going slowly, it would find you. And in terms of coping with the society that we're in, I'm struck actually I've been reading a lot of Robin Wall Kimmerer lately. So if you keep hearing her name out of my mouth or our mouths, there's good reason for it. And she wrote, actually, this was from an interview she did earlier this year in the New York Times. And in it, she's describing this resistance of the destructive aspects of our culture. And one way I have found to cope is in finding ways that I can resist. So so far am committed to not having a combustion vehicle, or at this point, any vehicle, to seeking out local and relational means of getting my food, or more and more of my food. And so there's this accumulation of these small acts of resistance, and in talking about them with others and sharing them with others and building that community where we can have a larger impact than an individual can, I think there's an opportunity there, not just for resistance, but for change, right? Because it's never an individual, it's always through collectives that we've seen change. And that there's this strength you can find in that context, right? Because if you are having a down day where you're overwhelmed by the crisis or just your work or whatever, others who are working toward those same good ends are there as a wellspring of strength. And so having that community is so crucial to coping, I think.
I don't know that I'm spiritually awake. I do know that I decide to do things that help me interact with my spirituality. And so one of the things I talked about was just like, when was the last time I remember being so like just in love with this idea of spirituality? And it was when I was a child, like just running around barefoot, hugging trees, talking to trees, not caring about what other people thought. And I feel like the older I got, like, and this kind of happens to a lot of us, is we leave behind all of those things that we deemed as childish, but in doing so, we chip away pieces of that innocence that helps us to be in touch with that spirituality. And so for me, it was like, I'm trying to get back to a lot of the things that I left behind in my youth. So spending more time outdoors in nature and having these conversations with people about nature. And then in terms of like consumer based, it is hard to have conversations back home about this stuff, because it's like, how can we sit here and have a conversation about like eco spirituality? How can I tell my neighbors that, like, oh, driving that like gas car is hurting the environment, but like they can't afford electric cars. Like they're not in positions where they can even have these conversations about things they can be doing to help the environment. Like it doesn't register for them right now because of the situations they're in. So that is another thing I'm grappling with, is how can we make it so that we're able to have these conversations, because their situations won't change a week from now, a year from now. So, but do we have that time? So how can we get to them now and bring them into the conversation? Yeah, that was a tangent, but.
We have time for one more question.
I love, sorry. I love this idea of community and purpose that you guys bring up in this talk. And I think it's very like easy to say that at St. Mary's, in a community like St. Mary's, it's very easy to practice eco spirituality and get people involved, because when you talk to someone, they listen, or you talk to a professor, they'll make time for you. And I volunteered in below the poverty line in Arkansas this summer. And I was just wondering what tips or tricks or advice do you have, kind of going off what you said, Sincere, like these people that don't even know where their next meal is coming from, how do you get them to think more eco spiritual, or to think less about like themselves and more about the community, and trying to create a community in an area where they don't see any spirituality or God or anything?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some things to offer. And, I have to go back to my own experience, so growing up in a neighborhood that was mostly an immigrant neighborhood. And so there were people from Eastern Europe. I lived on the west side of South Bend. So my grandmother and then father, and then we lived in my grandma's house. And so they were mostly from Poland and Hungary and Mexico, and there were African Americans. So it was a real mixed neighborhood, but everybody was lower on the economic platform. But I don't think anybody thought of themselves as poor. And I think we lived at that time where people found a way to sustain themselves. So you had, the backyard garden, and we lived more simply. We didn't need 2 cars and a television in every bedroom, and it was just a simpler time, so that there wasn't the same sense of poverty that I guess there is today. And I don't know how we get back to some of that. I think if collectively we can share more things, share the wealth. There's been such a stratification in the US in particular, between who holds wealth and who does not, and the majority do not. So we need that transition to really, I think, as a larger community of people here, ask for the things that would support people in community. So, when it comes to transportation, why not investment in more public transportation? Why not more community gardens? Why not efforts to go clean up the park? Why, when arguments are made to use resources, I think they always put jobs, this will create jobs. And we feel like, okay, there's an imperative to, again, rob again, and who do, the profits accrue to. So, yeah, we need that change. I think we need to demand it of our political leaders. We need to get out and vote, and make sure that people understand that those are our wishes. But, if we can communicate that message, starting with the person next to you and having that conversation and going from there, but to rethink what poverty means, because once you have your basic needs met, and there's no reason we can't in this country meet everybody's basic needs. Once you have food and shelter, more money doesn't make you happier. There's been many studies to prove that. So
yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there as well, and in your question. So thank you for sharing that. And I think you bring a really important perspective to the table, which is rooted in this extreme inequality that we've seen only grow in this country, even as GDP has risen, which should be a measure of quality of life or happiness. But of course, as Professor Tourtillotte said, we've seen that in the developed world, more money, more stuff doesn't lead to better lives, better outcomes. That being said, I spent many a poor Christmas, right? And when you have your first Christmas where things are well off, it is a totally different experience, right? Like when there are times when more money does make better your life, your quality, your level of stress, your ability to cope. And we have to be real about that when we're talking about conservation or we're talking about reducing resources. Those are not the communities that we need to reduce anything, right? And so when we have a single message about conservation or about reducing resource use, I think it obscures the fact that we need different things from different people. Even if we had, the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 1% of income earners or wealth havers in this country taking real action on resource conservation, we wouldn't need to ask anything of our country's poorest. We could actually infuse those communities with the resources they would need to meet those basic needs. And so starting with that isn't necessarily in a conversation with an individual, isn't necessarily going to get your foot in the door to help people think more, as you said, about spirituality and community and healing the wounds of the world. I don't necessarily know the best ways to do that, but I know there are people who study this a lot, and it has a lot to do with building trust and understanding and relating to their life, their lived experience, right? The real struggles that they're facing, and not leading with, well, we have to all drive electric cars or we all have to eat organic food. That would be wonderful. But it's in the context where we have these incredibly divided worlds that we're living in. So bridging that gap is one of the challenges of healing the world.
That is all so very true. Like this idea of trust is very important, and that needs to be established first. The problem is that there's a history of these communities being overlooked and left out of so many of these conversations. And so now we want to talk to them, but they're like, why should we pay attention now? Why should we be a part of the conversation now? And so I think a way to combat that is to go out there and act. Let them see you act. Let them see you making efforts to care and to be involved. And the fact that you were there says a lot, because this idea that we want to be there in community with them, and that is what is going to establish the trust that we need to start having these conversations. I think I said in my talk is that I find God in the people. And so people love to talk about themselves, find what interests them, and make connections about it. The fact that we're here talking about eco-spirituality, but all three of us gave testimonies of three different things, and yet we're having the same conversation because we were able to make connections through our individual talks says a lot. So just establishing the trust first, and then being able to have these conversations with them is very important.
Well, my own experience of listening to the three of you leaves me feeling more deeply rooted in a place and appreciative of the gifts in community, and part of a whole, a small part, protected feeling of being a part of a beautiful whole. So I really appreciate each one of you and the thoughts that you had to share today. And I invite everyone to thank our speakers for their contributions.